In 1910, a single report changed the course of human medicine forever. Not because it was right, because it was funded. A man named Abraham Flexner, with no medical degree and no clinical experience, visited over 150 medical schools across North America. He rated them, he ranked them, he decided which ones deserved to survive, and the ones he condemned the schools teaching botanical medicine, energy healing, hydrotherapy, homeopathy, nutritional therapy, and dozens of other traditions that had served human beings for centuries were defunded, shuttered, and erased from the record within a decade. The money that did this came from two names, Carnegie and Rockefeller. What followed was not a medical revolution. It was a corporate acquisition of the human body itself. If you want to go deeper on this and everything the official record refuses to explain, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists precisely for the stories that get buried. Now let's go back to 1910 and find out what was actually lost. The first method on this list is one most people have never heard of, because the very language used to describe it was systematically removed from mainstream medicine. It was called eclectic medicine. And for nearly a century before the Flexner Report, it was one of the most respected schools of healing in the United States. Eclectic practitioners were trained physicians who attended 4-year programs, published peer-reviewed journals, and operated hospitals. Their approach was simple. Use what works, regardless of where it comes from. They pulled from indigenous plant knowledge, European herbal traditions, mineral therapies, and clinical observation. The Eclectic Medical College of Cincinnati had been training doctors since 1845. By 1939, it was gone. Not because its methods failed. Because Flexner rated it poorly, Rockefeller withdrew support, and the licensing boards which were being restructured during this exact period began requiring credentials that only the newly funded allopathic schools could provide. The graduates of eclectic colleges found their licenses revoked in state after state as the new licensing boards took hold. Their patients were left with no explanation. Their textbooks went out of print and were not replaced. A century of documented clinical success disappeared into silence, and within a generation, most Americans had never heard the word eclectic used in a medical context at all. The second method erased in this period had been healing people across Europe and America for decades. Hydrotherapy, the structured use of temperature, pressure, and immersion to stimulate the lymphatic system, regulate the nervous system, and reduce inflammation. Sanitariums built around hydrotherapy protocols were producing documented results with conditions conventional medicine of the time could not touch. John Harvey Kellogg ran one of the most famous hydrotherapy institutions in the world at Battle Creek, Michigan. His results were remarkable. His documentation was extensive. After the Flexner reforms restructured medical licensing and insurance reimbursement, hydrotherapy ceased to be a reimbursable practice. Without insurance coverage, patients couldn't access it. Without patients, the sanitariums closed. Hydrotherapy didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because water cannot be patented. The third healing method, removed from this era, connects directly to something older, something tied to the civilization. Some researchers call Tartaria. It is called electrotherapy. Not the crude shock treatments weaponized in later psychiatric wards. The original electrotherapy practiced before 1910 was sophisticated and widely used. Low-frequency electrical stimulation, galvanic current applications, high-frequency Tesla-based resonance treatments. These were standard tools in mainstream physicians' offices in the 1880s and 1890s. Nikola Tesla himself demonstrated the medical applications of high-frequency current and published on it. He believed electromagnetic fields were fundamental to biological healing. The architecture researchers identify as Tartarian those massive buildings with copper domes, electromagnetic spires, and vaulted acoustic chambers has led some to theorize that a previous civilization had already mastered the medical use of electromagnetic energy. That Tesla was not inventing, he was remembering. The suppression of electrotherapy after 1910 severed that thread from public medicine entirely. The fourth method is homeopathy. And of all the systems targeted by the Flexner Report, homeopathy had the deepest institutional presence in America before 1910. There were 22 homeopathic medical colleges in the United States at the turn of the century, over 100 homeopathic hospitals. Homeopathic physicians had treated patients through every major epidemic of the 19th century: cholera, scarlet fever, typhoid, and their mortality statistics were, in documented cases, significantly lower than those of conventional hospitals. The Flexner Report gave homeopathic schools low ratings. Rockefeller funding was withheld. Licensing boards were restructured to require pharmacology-based training that homeopathic curricula did not provide. By 1923, only 2 homeopathic colleges remained. By 1950, they were gone. What was lost was not just a practice. It was a philosophy, one that treated the whole organism and sought to stimulate the body's own corrective intelligence rather than suppress its symptoms. The 5th method he raised connects directly to the most contested questions about what the pre-reset world actually knew. Magnetic healing, the therapeutic use of natural and artificially generated magnetic fields to influence biological processes. Practitioners in the late 19th century documented improvements in nerve pain, joint inflammation, circulatory disorders, and sleep disturbances. The researchers who study the architectural anomalies of the supposed reset period point to the magnetic and electromagnetic technology embedded in pre-1900 civic buildings, the iron frameworks, the copper channels, the inexplicable grounding systems built into structures that supposedly served only aesthetic purposes. If those buildings were, in part, therapeutic infrastructure, then the removal of magnetic medicine from the curriculum was a severing. After 1910, magnetic healing was classified as quackery. Its practitioners were stripped of licensure. The knowledge of how biological systems respond to magnetic fields did not re-enter mainstream medicine until researchers in the 1970s and 80s began quietly documenting what had been known a century before. The 6th method is botanical and herbal medicine, not casual folk use, but pharmacopoeia-grade practice with professional colleges, clinical standards, and published literature. The United States Pharmacopoeia included hundreds of plant-based preparations as late as 1905. After the Rockefeller-Carnegie restructuring of medical education, synthetic pharmaceutical compounds which could be patented and sold at enormous margin replaced botanical entries one by one. The herbalists who had practiced for decades found themselves without license. Their knowledge, stretching back through indigenous American traditions, European schools, Ayurvedic, Chinese, and Egyptian medical texts, was reclassified as anecdotal, not disproven. Reclassified. The distinction matters enormously, because anecdotal means we will not study this, and if we will not study it, we cannot acknowledge it, and if we cannot acknowledge it, it ceases to exist in the official record. The plants themselves did not change. They continued to contain the same alkaloids, the same anti-inflammatory compounds, the same antifungal and antiviral properties they had always contained. The knowledge was not invalidated. It was simply placed behind a wall that only funded research could penetrate, and the funding flowed exclusively to the laboratories of pharmaceutical manufacturers. The 7th method is naturopathy, supporting the body's healing capacity through food, clean water, sunlight, rest, and the removal of environmental toxins. Before 1910, naturopathic colleges trained practitioners in clinical nutrition, botanical medicine, hydrotherapy, and physical therapy. The results documented in naturopathic practice were substantial, particularly for the chronic degenerative diseases beginning to appear in industrializing populations. Diseases driven not by infectious agents, but by the conditions of modern life itself. The Flexner reforms cut naturopathy off from the medical mainstream so completely that it took a century to begin recovering credibility. The licensing battles that naturopathic doctors still fight in various American states today are a direct legacy of the 1910 restructuring. More importantly, the core premise of naturopathy that the body heals itself when given the right conditions was replaced by a model in which the body is a defective machine requiring external chemical management. That shift was not scientific, it was financial, and it has cost more human life than any single disease in the 20th century. The eighth method is Rife therapy, named after Royal Raymond Rife, a researcher who in the 1930s claimed to have identified specific electromagnetic frequencies capable of destroying pathogenic microorganisms without harming surrounding tissue. Rife built a universal microscope of extraordinary optical sophistication and conducted clinical trials with terminally ill cancer patients that produced results no one in the mainstream would acknowledge. Within a decade, his laboratory was raided, his equipment confiscated, and his collaborators prosecuted. Rife died in 1971, largely forgotten, having seen every documented record of his work systematically destroyed. The Tartaria researchers ask a pointed question. If a previous civilization had already discovered frequency-based medicine, if those stone chambers and copper-lined corridors served acoustic and electromagnetic therapeutic functions, then Rife was not a pioneer. He was a rediscoverer, and that is exactly why he was stopped. The ninth healing method erased is perhaps the most architecturally connected to Tartarian theory. Acoustic therapy, the structured use of sound frequencies and resonance to produce physiological change in biological tissue. The pre-Flexner researchers in acoustic medicine were documenting specific frequency ranges that influence nerve conduction, cellular permeability, and tissue repair. The architectural research around Tartaria has produced a compelling observation. The great civic buildings of the pre-reset world, the cathedrals, exhibition halls, public bathhouses were not merely beautiful, they were acoustically engineered. Their domes, vaults, and chambers produce specific, resonant frequencies when properly activated. Researchers have measured standing wave patterns in surviving pre-1900 buildings that correspond almost exactly to the frequency ranges used in modern therapeutic ultrasound research. If those buildings were designed to heal, if citizens of the Tartarian world walked through cities that were themselves therapeutic instruments, then acoustic medicine was not fringe, it was civic infrastructure. The 10th and final method is the one whose erasure was most thorough. It has no clean label, because what was removed was not a specific technique, but the entire philosophical foundation underlying every system on this list. It is called vitalism. The premise that living organisms possess an organizing intelligence not reducible to chemistry. That healing is the restoration of internal order, not the imposition of external correction. The Flexner report did not merely defund the schools that taught it, it redefined medicine itself, officially, legally, as the study and manipulation of biochemical mechanisms. The vital force was declared unscientific, not disproven, declared. And with that declaration went the coherent framework within which the previous 9 methods made sense. What replaced vitalism was not science, it was industry, a model of medicine in which the body generates revenue by being deficient, in which health is not a natural state to be supported but a product to be purchased. John D. Rockefeller's own personal physician, until the day he died, was a homeopath. His family used naturopathic and botanical remedies. He lived to 97, and he spent $50 million ensuring that none of that would be available to you. Within 15 years of the Flexner report, the number of medical schools in the United States had been cut in half. Within 30 years, every healing tradition on this list had been eliminated or driven underground. The practitioners who refused to retrain were prosecuted. The buildings that housed the colleges were repurposed or demolished. And here is where the Tartaria thread becomes impossible to dismiss, because the same decade, 1900 to 1910, corresponds to the final erasure of pre-reset architectural and technological infrastructure. The Great Exposition buildings, the electromagnetic towers, the freestanding, copper-domed civic structures were demolished in exactly the years when the medical knowledge that would have made them legible was being removed from education. You cannot understand what a hydrotherapy hall was for if hydrotherapy has been classified as pseudoscience. You cannot interpret an electromagnetic tower as medical infrastructure if electromagnetic medicine has been removed from every curriculum. The erasure of the knowledge and the erasure of the architecture happened simultaneously in the same decade, under the same funding sources. That may be coincidence. But if it is not, If what happened in 1910 was the final phase of a deliberate civilizational reset, then what was erased was not merely medical knowledge, it was memory. The inherited understanding of what the human body actually is, what it responds to, how it heals, and what kind of world it was designed to live in. The body remembers things the curriculum has forgotten. People who stand in certain old buildings feel something they cannot explain. People who return to food, water, rest, and plants find healing that the official record insists is impossible. What was taken in 1910 was not just medicine. It was the map back to something much older, something that understood the human body not as a machine to be repaired, but as a living field to be tended. Something that built its cities as instruments of health rather than monuments to commerce. And the people who funded that erasure knew exactly what they were buying. The question that remains, the one this channel will keep asking, is whether enough of that map survived, and whether we are finally ready to read it.